Continuing on with model, spec, and calibration, we'll take a look at a puzzle. When do you just put the curve you want in directly as an equation, and when do you build the structure which results in that behavior? We'll puzzle with that a little bit, and then we'll move on to some examples of specification, including one that kind of reinforces the initializing and steady state idea that I very briefly mentioned in the previous slide cast. In the context of model, specification, calibration, this question of whether to use an equation or to build the feedback structure that yields the expected behavior. Let me use briefly the example of S-shaped growth. We know how to build a little structure that yields S-shaped growth. We also now know there's an equation, the logistic equation in the previous slide cast, that we could actually just force that shape to result in the relationship between two variables. And that's a kind of an interesting puzzle. If our goal is, if we truly just have a relationship between two variables and there's nothing else of interest, we just want to make sure that anxiety is related to money and bank account in an explicit way, then we would really just want to find what's the right equation so that we get the value of anxiety at any value of money and bank that we might have at any given time. We want to translate that, think of that as translation into an anxiety value. Then we clearly just want to use an equation. But if there's more going on and we'd like to have the value of anxiety not only be influenced by the amount of money in the bank, but maybe other factors, then we're going to have to put in the model logic, which would kind of at baseline maybe give us all of the things being equal in S-shaped growth. But that S could be skewed all over the place as other things are changing in the system. Then we might build the structure. If that doesn't totally seem clear to you, that's okay. We can certainly have an additional dialogue about that. We actually addressed this anxiety question back in one of the earlier labs, and we talked about it. But to review the question again now with a little bit more experience under our belts, do we want to model anxiety as a storage where debt influences the maybe increasing amounts, how much stress is coming in, which would be an example of using a feedback structure, or should we just put a relationship in like some of the equations we just looked at in the previous slide cast? And one of the questions you might ask yourself, whether or not to use a stock for something versus just an equation, is if the input values stopped changing, does that mean that the stock should stop right where it is, or the outcome variable, anxiety in this case, should stop changing? Or if it could continue to adjust even though the main input, which is, let's say your debt was constant, does that mean that anxiety would never change at that point? If that's true, then you might just make it a straight equation. But quite often we would say, well, this kind of variable is coupled in lots of ways in our system, so it might be better to bring it in as a kind of a state variable and not just try to put an equation in for it. So again, there's never going to be a right answer when we're trying to put in equations for qualitative concepts, subjective concepts. Sometimes they're vitally important to get our models to actually reflect how the real world works, and we're going to have to accept a certain amount of ambiguity in the specification of them. On the previous slide, I used the word ambiguity, maybe uncertainty or uncomfortableness, not being absolutely sure that we've got it right would be a better way to put it. Okay, now this is a little bit of more of an empirical example of how might we use a little snippet of empirical data to help us build a relationship. This has to do with a study that was done up at OHSU years ago using lab rats, and they were kind of experimenting how food supply affected behavior of rats. And one of the outcomes, this was not the primary purpose of the experiments, they weren't starving the rats to death on purpose, they were looking at the behavior in crowded situations. And so they had this little tiny bit of data, and I just provided it here. The feeding rate went from 10 to 50 to 100 to 500, so a factor of 50, a huge variation, and the number of deaths as a result were dramatically influenced in an inverse relationship. So how might we do that? For example, could we say that the death fraction, and the total amount of rats we started with was 50, so we have something to work with. Maybe it's some parameter times population divided by food. So the more food you have, the less deaths you're going to have, that inverse relationship. So here we give an example of using a table where we just experiment with equations that might move us closer and closer to a fairly simple equation that reflects the sort of high degree of nonlinearity in this interrelationship. And we could have just put a graphical function in, but that wouldn't have been a smooth function. They don't interpolate or extrapolate particularly beautifully. So I often, as I've mentioned, try to come up with an actual formula rather than using the graphical capabilities available. Sometimes using graphical stuff is just fine, though, so I don't mean to be discouraging you if you lean towards expressing complex relationships graphically. All right, so here's the table, and it's a little bit busy, but if you read across the top, first I put in the food and I put in the deaths, the same data we saw earlier. Then we want to compute something called death fraction. So dividing the numbers out, we want to compute the 0.4, 0.1, 0.06. That's the number we want to compute. So we want column A to be translated into column B, and we know it's an inverse. So our initial guess is just to divide the food by the the population by the food, and that number gives us something that is going in the right direction. So comparing column D now, the P over F, 5, 1, 0.5, 0.1. Look, it goes in the same direction as the left-hand column, except they're way different. So if I scale it and divide by 0.1, then I'm looking at column E here. 0.5 to 0.4, that's pretty close. 0.1, 0.1, that's exactly. 0.5, 0.06, almost the same. But that last value drops all the way to 0.01 instead of 0.04. So it's like too exaggerated. So if I take the square root of the function, that's a way of making it not go to such extremes. I soften the non-linearity by taking the square root. So that column now looks, you can see that what's in the column that begins with 0.7, 0.3, and that's now a little too, we like the 0.1 at the end, but the 0.7 now is too big compared to 0.4. So I factored that a little bit, and I ended up with numbers way on the right-hand side, which you can compare. And so that's my way of talking my way through, sort of experimentally, coming up with a formula that matches a small set of points reasonably well. Now you could say, well, why didn't you just put that into Excel and do a curve fit analysis? But actually, it's not so automatic. And while I'm a big fan of doing things formally, as in using regression, in this particular case, I wanted to kind of think about the relationship as I went. So that's why I show you sort of my kind of more ad hoc, if you please, or qualitative way of coming up with a relationship. And that's summarized at the bottom as this is now the equation that I could put into my model in order to put in, to build a model where I wanted the death rate to be proportional to the amount of food. And I'm going to be running experiments that are maybe more complex, but this relationship between food and starvation needs to be captured. Another example, and this is one where I do illustrate the idea of initializing in steady state. I think that'll come through as we talk about it. So here, this is just a demonstration model specification. That's what this is really all about, and calibration in both of these steps. So I sort of have this intuitive feel that we have the human body needs oxygen, and at rest, we have to breathe at a certain rate. Our heart pumps at a certain rate to deliver oxygen to all of our cells. And so I see that there's a main chain. We have oxygen that's located in the lungs. We have oxygen located in the blood. And it then moves out of the blood based on exercise. So rate 1 is proportional to breaths per minute. That's oxygen coming into the system. Rate 2 is proportional to heartbeat, which is moving it into the tissues. And rate 3 is the rate at which oxygen is being used in the combustion or in the metabolism process. And that's related to jumping jacks per minute. If I'm sitting there, that's 0, and then as I start to do exercise, I need more oxygen to do that. So my pulse is some resting pulse rate plus some factor that increases as the oxygen in the blood decreases and I need to bring more oxygen to the tissues. Breaths per minute is some resting breaths per minute plus some factor that increases as the oxygen in the lung decreases and I need to breathe faster now to bring more oxygen into the lungs. So I have an initial flow diagram that I just sort of sketched out, which is on the next page. And then I actually had to add a couple of things afterwards that I forgot, and I described that as part of my log of this model creation experiment. So you see here the main chain, oxygen in lungs to oxygen in blood, and the 3 rates that we described earlier. There's some parameters around here, but the main thing you can see is there's this loop that says down at the bottom, there's ideal oxygen, kind of below oxygen, then there's a delta, which is comparing those two, and that's going to be used to add to resting breaths per minute to get actual breaths per minute, which is going to then determine the rate at which oxygen comes in through inhalation. There's an identical structure with resting pulse, oxygen in the ideal oxygen in the blood, so the same closed loop right there. So those are the 2 main loops in the system. And then off on the right, depending on the activity rate, this system is sort of driven from the right-hand side. As the jumping jacks go up, we pull down oxygen in the blood, which forces the heart to beat faster, which pulls down the oxygen in the lung, which forces me to breathe faster. So that's the kind of design of the model. So to get this operational, I need to think through the logic. So how do we back into, this is one of those cases where I think I know how fast my heart beats and at rest and how much it changes when I exercise. So this is going to be an activity of illustrating that concept of backing into parameters that I think is a useful thing. I mean, yes, you could say, well, why don't I just go get data on this? But I think a combination of empirical work and sort of analytical thinking, that kind of reflects what we know is useful. So assume that at rest, oxygen is evenly distributed between the lungs and blood. We could verify this with research. And maybe I have a tendency to wing it as a person, but when I do serious research, I start there and then I go get the facts to figure out what needs to be done. And I'm encouraging you to be willing to use your intuitions and develop your intuitions, but not to believe that somehow you don't need to go get the facts. You do need to get the facts. And in that diagram, I forgot to put resting breaths per minute, which is another parameter. And so I set the resting pulse rate to 60. That's actually about what my resting pulse rate is, so that's actually a good number. And since we only can live a few minutes without breathing, I said, let's assume that if we reduce the amount of oxygen by 50% in either of the storages, that would be a really big problem. So we're going to definitely need to set the parameters so that we don't allow the amount of oxygen to be depleted to near zero. That would be fatal. So if the resting pulse of 60 keeps us properly supplied, then the rate of oxygen in the blood must be pulse times 50 over 60. So that gives me the parameter for how I relate pulse to getting blood into the tissues. We then assume that the maximum value for jumping jacks is, say, 60. That's 1 per second. And that causes the heart to get up to 150 beats per minute. So that's when I measure my heart rate, when I'm in the zone of aerobic exercise, that's about what we work towards. So I can use pretty solid information to back into the correct parameters. And this particular model, the parameters are qualitatively, they're not described in units that we use. So if I was an exercise physiologist, I would not do it this way. I would go use the actual measures, the actual measured values. We can measure oxygen, etc., etc. So believe me, I understand that this is an illustrative learning model rather than a scientific model at this stage. But I wanted to show you the process by which I go through thinking about how do I get parameter values. And the rest of that logic is written here. I'm not going to read all this off to you, but just gives you an idea of how you might go about thinking your way to a workable model, let's say on exercise 2 or exercise 3 for this class, or for a model of your own choosing in something you care about. There's a few more parameters to figure out here. The inhalation rate, backing up now to the first part of the left-hand side of the model, the inhalation rate must be 50 when breaths per minute equal a resting rate of 15. So the coefficient would be 4. And then I made a mistake here. Later I catch it. That's not correct. If we divide 50 by 15, we don't get 4. But we'll catch that later. Jumping jacks per minute is an input function. It could be a constant, 0. It could be a step function, and we'll play with that later in the model. This leaves us with the important pulse. heartbeats per minute and breaths per minute to calibrate. And I talk through this. Rather than read all these words off, I'd have you read through there. And the idea is that you know what you want to get out. You know what the flow needs to be under different conditions. And so you can back into the parameter value. And I explain the logic fairly clearly here. And so once I get those worked out, just as described here, I then set jumping jacks per minute to be equal to 0 and try the model run. Yeah, this is an auto-scaled graph, which we often get when we first push the button. And if you look closely at those headings, the O2 varies only like 0.2%. It looks dramatic here because of the auto-scaling. But we can see that the oxygen in the lungs is off by a certain amount. And this is that error that I mentioned earlier. If we change the parameter value from 4 to the corrective value of 3.3, then we get steady state as shown here. And this is the idea of figuring out all the flows to be in balance. And of course, the human body at rest should be roughly in balance. So it's a very good case example to illustrate how we can really help get our parameters right by initializing the model in steady state. Then when we take the model out of steady state, we can look at its response, which is an additional cross-check on how quickly does the body respond to jumping jacks. Well, pretty darn fast, and it better do that or we don't have some of the parameters right. So now I start the model running in steady state, and then after a short amount of time, I change the jumping jacks from 0 to 60 per minute. And then here's what's happened. You see at the right. And this worried me. It looked like we were not able to get the O2 replenished back up afterwards. It looks like we're working at an oxygen deficit. And I doubled the parameters. I got pretty much the same shape, except that I got it to not drop so much. And I got to worrying, did I build my model wrong? And then I said, wait a minute, maybe I'm plotting the wrong thing. Oxygen would decrease until the exercise stops. I mean, the system is trying to maintain it, but as long as I'm stressing it, I would expect to see some drop within normal, sustainable parameters. It shouldn't drop so much that the body's not going to be able to function. And really, this is an illustrative model. Probably the amount that the oxygen is dropping is exaggerated here dramatically, but it's more to illustrate the principle of how a feedback system works and how you might get an initial calibration to work. And probably once you started doing your library research on exactly how much the body allows, I have a feeling it maintains a very tight rein on the amount of oxygen flowing through. There's not a lot of give and take there. So the size of the drop in percentages is probably way too large here. But the idea is, as you start to consume the oxygen in your system and replenish it, there is going to be some change from baseline, and the body's striving to maintain steady state, but it won't be able to perfectly achieve it. Just like your home heating system doesn't maintain a perfect temperature, it drops a little bit, then heats it back up. The body is much more complex than a home heating system, but it's kind of the same idea. So instead of continuous exercise, I stop the pulse after 10 time units. So we jumping jacks for a while and then we stop. And this is what the input equation looks like for JJPM. And then I look a little further out in time so we can see how the system tends to return when they stop. And now I'm much happier. Yes, the amount of oxygen drops somewhat, but it comes back up to normal. And I feel like this is a demonstration of an initial calibration that's plausible and some parameter values that we could work with. Now we have to go do our homework if we wanted to build this into a real model and get it much closer to how the body really works. And that could be orders of magnitude more work than the sort of illustrative version that we have here. And for reference, I provided the equation. I just want to comment. If you look through, you could read these equations. And so even though many of us are very uncomfortable with mathematics and equations, when you actually look at it, most of these equations make sense, especially now that you've been introduced a little bit to the idea. And this is not, it may look like mumbo jumbo, but if you actually stop and read it, we use kind of very descriptive names here, so it makes it very wordy sounding, but it does tell you the story of how this little system works in an operational way. I mean, that's kind of the main point here. And this is something you could hand to somebody else and say, do you think it works like this? And they could look at that and say, no, I don't think it works like that. So between the diagram and the support that's coming from the equations, we have a complete description of our mental model for how we think this system works, this little control system, in a simplified way. That's incredibly useful. And I'm doing something like this, trying to understand how the body recovers from concussion. It's way more complex. But the diagrams I'm using allow me to sit down with somebody who knows neuroscience and say, does it work like this or not? They can think about it. It gives us a communication tool. And that alone is really very, very important if we're going to understand really complex, in this case, diseases that happen after a concussion that keep people in disabled states for sometimes years. I think if we're going to correct this, we need to understand all those interconnections. Just a cautionary note, this little toy model is exactly that. And even if the model seems to assume reference behavior, we are not at all done. We need to torture test the heck out of this model, go get real empirical support. There's a lot more work to do. So getting a model initially calibrated, we want to shout, victory, like I did, bingo, very dramatic. But then I have to immediately catch my breath and say, wait a minute, I'm just getting started.